Perceptual categorization. One of the simplest ways to categorize stimuli is to group them together based on shared physical features. This perceptual categorization uses sensory input in one modality, such as vision or olfaction, to identify similarities between different stimuli and to group them together accordingly. Note that perceptual categorization is not defined by the sensory information that organisms can detect. Species differences in sensory detection are discussed in Chapter 2. Perceptual discrimination, the reverse of perceptual categorization, uses sensory information to distinguish between items. Because perceptual categorization and discrimination are manifested as similar and different responses to sensory stimuli, the topics are sometimes discussed as stimulus control of behavior. Stimulus generalization. Experimental investigations of perceptual categorization often rely on stimulus generalization tests. In the simplest of these, subjects are trained to respond to one sensory stimulus, e.g., a light of a particular wavelength, and then tested with a range of stimuli that vary across this sensory dimension. Unlike categorization tests in which subjects make a single response to indicate group membership, i.e., they are rewarded for pecking an image that portrays a moth, generalization tests measure the strength of responding to different stimuli. The result is a stimulus generalization gradient, see Figure 9.2. As expected, the training stimulus elicits the strongest response with a gradual decline in responding as the similarity between training and test stimuli is reduced. Stimulus generalization gradients, such as those shown in Figure 9.2a, have been generated for many different species using a variety of sensory stimuli. It appears, therefore, that animals have a natural tendency to respond in a similar way to stimuli that share perceptual features. A key component of stimulus generalization tests is that they allow researchers to determine how variations in one sensory dimension alter responding. This, in turn, provides clues as to how subjects categorize stimuli with common features. A completely flat stimulus generalization gradient, see Figure 9.2b, indicates that subjects cannot distinguish the sensory properties of different test stimuli, or that they have not learned to differentiate training and test stimuli. The latter possibility can be tested by introducing discrimination training. Responses to one stimulus are reinforced, whereas responses to another are not. See Figure 9.2c. For example, training pigeons to peck a key when they hear a 1000 Hz tone, but not when they hear a 950 Hz tone, produces a very steep stimulus generalization gradient. Figure 9.2. Stimulus generalization gradients in 3 versions of an auditory discrimination test in pigeons. A. Birds were trained to peck a key for food reward in the presence of a 1000 Hz tone. If the tone was turned off, responding was not reinforced. B. Pigeons were trained to peck a key for a food reward. A 1000 Hz tone was turned on throughout the entire session. C. Birds were trained to peck a key for food reward in the presence of a 1000 Hz tone and to withhold responding in the presence of a 950 Hz tone. Okay, so there's 3 graphs that are scatter plots, and on the y-axis is rate of pecking, and on the x-axis is the testing tones in Hertz from 300 to 3600. So in the first condition A, when a bird pecks while the 1000 Hz tone is turned on, they get a food reward. So the result of that is for the testing tones that you get a generalization gradient centered around the 1000 Hz and tapering off in either direction, kind of like a normal curve, but more like a triangle in this case, in either direction. In graph B, the pigeons are pecking for a food reward and the 1000 Hz is always on. So of course they don't peck more around 1000 Hz, they just peck whenever. So that's closer to a uniform distribution over the different tones. They're not associating them. And then in graph C, While the 1000 hertz tone is on and a bird pecks, they get a food reward, but they're also trained to not respond in the presence of a 950 hertz tone, so here the generalization gradient is very narrow, centering right around 1000, and it does not taper off on either end because they're trained not to have that generalization gradient. They're trained to discriminate between these very precise sound tones. In essence, discrimination training is providing feedback on how to categorize stimuli according to sensory properties. Over repeated trials in which stimuli from different categories are presented, individuals acquire the ability to detect subtle differences in sensory features. This process forms the basis of many forms of expertise in humans. For example, wine connoisseurs often spend years comparing the sight, smell, and taste of wines from different regions, different grapes, and different vintages. This experience allows them to classify wines according to characteristics that vary along each sensory dimension. The more similar two wines are, the more difficult it is to tell them apart, and the more expertise is required to do so. The same principle can be applied to expert birders, who identify species using subtle differences in visual or auditory traits, such as beak shape or call note. As with discrimination training in lab animals, these individuals are using a two-stage process of categorization. First, they focus on one stimulus modality, e.g., the smell of the wine or the sound of the bird call. Second, they identify variations within this modality. Perceptual categorization, therefore, illustrates the complementarity of cognitive processing. Attention, memory, and sensory discrimination must all work together to accomplish the task of correctly classifying novel stimuli. Categorization or feature recognition. The ability of many animals to categorize stimuli based on a single sensory feature, such as the pitch of a tone, often extends to more complex stimuli. Close to 50 years ago, Herrnstein and Loveland, 1964, provided evidence that pigeons can discriminate photos that show a human from those that do not, an effect that was replicated with dogs, monkeys, and orangutans. Pigeon categorization studies were later extended to photos of water and trees, with subjects correctly classifying novel exemplars of all three categories. An experiment using pseudo-categories, random collections of stimuli that have no obvious cohesive feature, indicated that pigeons had not simply memorized which stimuli would be reinforced and which would not. As shown in Figure 9.3, pigeons learned to categorize photos of chairs, cars, flowers, and humans much more quickly than if the items from each category were mixed together to form arbitrary groups, i.e. pseudo-categories. As expected, memorizing individual items within a category is much more difficult than learning to group stimuli together based on common features. Figure 9.3, Experimental Design A and Results B of a Perceptual Categorization Experiment in Pigeons. A. On each trial, a visual stimulus was presented in the center of a screen. Birds were required to peck one of 4 keys located in outer corners of the screen. Depending on the category of stimulus presented, people, cars, flowers, or chairs. B. Overtraining. Birds responded at higher than chance levels, i.e. 25%, for each stimulus category. Stimuli that were presented previously, i.e. repeated, were categorized at higher rates than non-repeated stimuli. C. Pseudo-categories were formed by placing the same number of stimuli randomly selected from each category into different groups. In other words, each category was made up of a random collection of people, cars, flowers, and chairs. Compared to natural categories, pigeons were impaired at correctly classifying items within pseudo-categories. Okay, so there's a very dapper pigeon, and he's looking at a touch screen, and in one corner is trees, one corner is a person, a man, one corner is a car, and one corner is a chair. Okay, So then we have 4 scatter plots. On the y-axis is percent correct choice. On the x-axis is 4-day blocks from 0 to 12. So as the number of trials increases, the number of times that they correctly choose either the car, chair, flower, or person category increases a lot, all the way up to almost 100% for car by the end. Actually, almost 100% for all of them. And the more that it's repeated, the better they do. Okay, and the last graph is the same 4-day blocks and percentage. And you can see that their ability to discern items in pseudocategories only eventually reaches about 40%, whereas being able to correctly place an item in a category of the person, flower, car, and chair categories increases much faster than the pseudo-category percent, all the way up to about 80% versus the 40% for pseudo-category, so it's much stronger. It is tempting to conclude that pigeons are solving the categorization task in the same way that most humans would, by identifying the object in each photo. However, even if the two species place items in the same categories, it does not imply that they are using the same criteria to do so. Indeed, by manipulating computer images of the photos, Huber and colleagues revealed that pigeons were relying on visual features, such as texture or shape, to correctly categorize images containing humans. Similarly, monkeys focus on the presence or absence of red patches on facial images to classify photos of humans versus non-humans. And orangutans use the color and placement of eyes to distinguish subclasses of primates. Experiments such as these led many researchers to conclude that perceptual categorization in pigeons, and probably many other animals, results from stimulus generalization of specific sensory elements. In other words, the data cannot be taken as evidence that animals are grouping photographs into categories, such as one defined as human. Natural categories. If animals rely on feature recognition to group stimuli together, this cognitive mechanism may be the basis for identifying different classes of prey, predators, and mates. From an evolutionary perspective, therefore, it makes sense to examine which aspects of sensory stimuli animals are predisposed to attend to, and how they use this information to judge group membership. The same principle emerged as a guiding force in human research, inspired by the pioneering work of cognitive psychologist Eleanor Rosch. Rosch pointed out that many lab experiments of categorization bore little resemblance to how subjects classify stimuli or events in the real world. Based on her cross-cultural work, a different type of comparative research, Rosch hypothesized that categorization is a fluid cognitive process that depends on interactions with the environment. Individuals may have a mental representation of the criteria that define a category, but these criteria will be updated constantly by their experience with real-world events. This led Rosch and her colleagues to advocate a focus on natural, rather than experimenter-defined categories, as a means to understand how organisms make sense of their world. One of the best examples of natural category research in animals is the analysis of songbird communication by the neuroethologist Peter Marler. See Chapter 12 for extended discussion of this research. Birdsong, as the name implies, is a complex sound pattern that varies across time. See Figure 9.4. Each song can be described by features such as the frequency range of notes in the song, the number of notes produced, as well as the duration of notes and phrases. Although researchers knew that songs conveyed information about territoriality and reproduction, they did not understand how song features allowed birds to classify this information. For example, which aspect of the song signals whether the singer is an aggressor or a potential mate? Marler and his colleagues addressed the question by testing how alterations in specific stimulus features, e.g. range or number of notes, alter naturalistic behavior. In a sample experiment, they played recordings of the average conspecific song from the area, i.e., they selected the median of each of the identified features and then modified one feature at a time until a response, such as aggression, was elicited. Figure 9.4 Natural categories of birdsong in swamp sparrows. Song phrases were classified into categories based on the length of the initial note in the phrase. Category 1, 3 to 13 milliseconds. Category 6, 14 to 35 milliseconds. Territorial responses, measured as number of wing waves, were recorded across repeated presentations of phrases. When the phrases were all within one category or the other, response declined, i.e., habituated. In contrast, responses remained elevated when song phrases from categories 1 and 6 were presented across trials, suggesting that birds did not treat these as a single category. Importantly, song phrases were selected for the between-category presentation, such that the differences between the length of the initial notes was less than the difference in the initial note length of song phrases presented in either Category 1 or Category 6. Okay, so this is a bar graph. On the y-axis is number of wing waves from 0 to 8, and on the x-axis are the three categories of within Category 1, between categories, and within Category 6. Okay, so within Category 1, the initial note duration was from 3 milliseconds to 13 milliseconds, and within Category 6, the initial note duration was between 14 milliseconds to 35 milliseconds. Okay, so then they chose something between, I guess, the 13 milliseconds and the 14 milliseconds for their between categories. So the wing waves was low and decreased within Category 1 and Category 6, but for the in-between category, the wing waves stayed high at 6 and did not attenuate, indicating it was interpreted as being a part of more than one category. The difference between this approach and the categorization experiments described above is that Marler was asking which stimulus variants produce a meaningful difference to the animal, rather than testing whether birds are capable of distinguishing two or more variants. In much the same way that crickets divide notes into high and low groups, swamp sparrows use the frequency of initial notes to classify a song. In other words, as shown in Figure 9.4, birds responded differently to songs beginning with notes that fell above or below a threshold. Most importantly, two notes that were the same distance apart but did not cross this threshold value elicited the same response. This suggested that birds were classifying notes based on a criterion for group membership and not simply responding to differences along a stimulus continuum. A similar process occurs with speech perception, in that humans make categorical judgments about phonemes, the smallest unit of sound in a language, based on threshold values. For example, if recorded consonants are synthetically altered, humans perceive a sudden shift from phonemes such as B to G. Small changes that cross a consonant boundary are labeled as different phonemes, whereas large changes within one category are not. Marler's work also revealed that the features songbirds use to categorize other songs depend on the auditory environment. Within a given habitat, birds are likely to hear songs and calls from their own species, as well as those of other species. They must be able to classify the conspecific vocalizations without getting these confused with signals from other birds. Field sparrows, living in the northeastern United States, rely on alterations in note frequency, as opposed to other features such as note duration, to categorize conspecific songs. This makes sense in terms of the local soundscape, as note frequency is the thing that distinguishes field sparrow song from other birdsong in the area. Songbirds in other regions may use a different criterion to classify songs, depending on the features of songs emitted by surrounding populations. An important point about this work is that the bird's classification system is based on experience with their natural environment. The cognitive process of grouping meaningful stimuli together is inherited, whereas the specific categories that animals respond to are learned. In humans, Perceptual categorization is also a combination of inherited and acquired abilities, although the distinction between the two can be difficult to decipher. See box 9.2.